Today we're installing a dual cooler kit for the Ford Ranger 6-speed. This kit also suits the Mazda BT50 6-speed, the Ford Ranger 10-speed and the Ford Everest 10-speed. Let's get into it. The first step here is to remove the top rad panel, and then we'll remove the grille as well. This panel is actually held in just by 3 clips. Some other models are slightly bigger, depending on the year of the vehicle. When you're removing these clips, you've got to reach your hand under and pop them like that. If you don't do that correctly, they will break and snap off. This panel has been off before, so it's already previously broken. Next step is to remove the grille. This grille has 2 clips, 1 each side. Then it's retained with more clips along the base of the bumper bar. Some other models have bolts that you have to remove. Some other have bolts that you have to remove from here with a little bracket. Just keep that one in mind. Other models will have a panel clicked into here that covers the intercooler. This one has already been removed due to the intercooler upgrade. Next step, we'll be removing this bash plate here to gain access to underneath to where we're installing the cooler. Alright, next part, we're going to install the hoses onto the cooler. First we'll start with the short hose, and we install. You're going to make sure that the hose is linking both the coolers. So on the front cooler, we go to the top hose. Also, it's good to note which way you've orientated the clamp and make it so you can access it once it's actually installed in the vehicle. All right, we'll tighten up these bolts. Our next part, we install the 5-meter length. At this time, we don't trim, we don't separate the 5-meter length, we leave it as one piece, and then once we've routed the hose to the transmission, that's when we cut it to length. And also don't forget the clamp. I like to just unravel the hose just to try to get the curl out of it a little bit. Makes it a bit easier to route later on. Now we go install into the car. If you're having troubles installing with the cooler hoses routing, these brackets are also got extra holes so they can be orientated 90 degrees, so the barbs are fitting down. we've tried to always do it the same to keep out of the way of winches and other accessories the customers fit. Because this vehicle has actually got a larger intercooler, it's actually a bit tight to get the bracket in. And there we go. We got past the intercooler. Now we've got to put the bracket underneath the rad support, and it lines up with this hole that's already in the rad support. The bolt that we supply in the kit, we install it now. Depending on the model of vehicle that you have, if you have a BT50, sometimes you'll need to use this spacer that we supply in our kit. It will offset the cooler, so it will put the cooler on an angle and give you more clearance for the grille. The next step is to feed the hoses down to underneath the vehicle. All right, once the hoses are fed down underneath, I like to install a cable tie just to hold these two together. And then we can start routing once we get the hoist up in the air. Next part, we will fit the screws that are supplied in the kit into the bottom of the bracket. Before fitting these screws, have a quick look and make sure that your cooler is actually vertically upright and down. Make sure it's not at an angle, basically. All right, next we're going to route the hoses. I like to keep a little bit of slack up here at this end in case you need to reduce the hose later on. There is plenty of length here. And also try to keep the hoses a nice curvature. Don't bend the hoses. Normally I like to route the transmission hoses on top of the chassis rail on the passenger side. But some of these models actually have what I believe to be a power steering cooler pipe that sit on top of the chassis rail. Because that's there, there's just no room for the hoses to go there as well. So if that's there, then I'll trim a little bit of the foam at the bottom of the radiator and go underneath the radiator. Just remember all this section is protected with the factory bash plate. Just like so. I'll actually cable tie the hoses to the bottom radiator hose as well. All right, we're feeding the hoses on the inside of the chassis rail. And I've just grabbed from the inside of the wheel arch, and I've grabbed the hoses to pull them through a little bit. Now that they're no longer twisted, I'll chuck a cable tie around this area. Now we're cable tying to another hose that's actually secured to the chassis rail right now. Next part is we'll be removing the inner wheel well rubber mat. This part usually gets taken off quite often because this is the area where you would access to replace the engine oil filter. And it's held in by several of these screws, little plastic screw rivets. I won't be removing this rubber panel completely. I will just take out the ones on the right hand side, and then I'll fold it underneath the brake hose just out of the way. And because these get taken out quite often, they can actually be stripped a little bit, and the screwdriver no longer works with them. Once you've got those lower ones out, I can just fold it out of the way. Next part, we secure the hoses to a large conduit hose. If I'm not mistaken, I think it's an aircon hose. The reason why I attach it to that part is that we need to gain access to the oil filter, or whoever's servicing the engine needs to gain access to the oil filter housing. After we've attached it there, we can feed it down towards the transmission. And now that we've got the hose fed all the way down to the transmission, it actually locates into here, so when I show you the unions. But at this point, we will remove the tail shaft to gain better access to the transmission cooler that we have to remove. You can actually take the transmission cooler off without taking the tail shaft out of the way, but due to this one's had extra accessories, it will be a lot trickier. So just undo the front half and just drop it down. Next step is to remove the coolant hoses going to the heat exchanger that we'll be removing so we can fit our cooler hoses to the transmission. The coolant hoses are here, one there, one there, and we just clamp it off with some hose clamps that we have. This will stop or minimise the amount of coolant that we lose. Gain access to the above the chassis rail, the inner guard. We'll be removing the hose clamps next. If you have a pair of long pointies, they can come in handy. And just like that, squeeze and drop them down. Sometimes those clamps are actually glued to the hose, so you can do a lot of twisting to actually break the glue off the clamp. Before I take the hoses off the heat exchanger, I'll start undoing the heat exchanger bolts, just so we're all prepared. And there's 4 bolts that hold the heat exchanger on, one underneath it, and then there's 2 above, and then there's one holding the actual bracket onto the transmission. I tend to take the top bolts out first. Depending on the year of the vehicle, you may actually have Torx bolts. This bracket it doesn't come on the 10-speed transmissions. If you order the 10-speed cooler kit, the bracket will be included in the kit. I just straighten off the split pins and twist and slide them out. Now before we take out the last 2 bolts, we'll take the hoses off. Right, once you remove the clamps and broken the seals, you can remove the hoses, and then we'll take the heat exchanger off. I'm just using a lever bar to push the hose off the fitting. And hopefully, as long as those clamps are clamped, you should only lose minimal amount of coolant. Now that we've got both the hoses off, we can take the remainder bolts out of the exchanger. And that's the bracket that we use to hold our unions that we supply. And lever a little bit just to pop the O-rings. And there's the other 2 points that you couldn't see that mount to the transmission. Now that the heat exchange is out of the way, we can fit the J-pipe that's supplied in the kit also. This will just complete the circuit and take the place of the heat exchanger. Now, so the J-pipe connects the 2 coolant hoses that connect up to the heat exchanger. We no longer need the heat exchanger. It is a point of failure. They have been known to mix up the coolant with the transmission oil, and then it's a full rebuild and then a decent clean of the cooling system. Once the hose clamps are tight, we can remove the hose clamps, and then we can secure the J-pipe to the transmission with the P-clamp that's supplied in the kit. We reused one of the bolts that was holding the heat exchanger. And make sure that the J-pipe isn't touching the bell housing or the floor. If they are, it does cause vibration issues. Then I also just put another cable tie around the 2 hoses, again just to stop vibration. I'm just cleaning down some of the oil that's leaked out of the transmission once the heat exchanger was removed. Yeah, it's a solvent. We're going to fit the new unions. These take the spot of the heat exchanger, and they will be secured with the bracket that was securing the heat exchanger. And they just push in with they've got double O-rings, like so. The bracket will go over the top of them, and we reuse that bolt. Now, if you were fitting a temperature sensor on this as well, the bottom fitting is the hot pipe, so that would be the one you would put the temperature sensor on. Give that a little bit of a wash down. Right, next part is we're going to fit the transmission cooler hose to those unions. This is the point where we sort of work out how long we need the hose. There will be a little bit extra. I like to route it so we've got a nice curvature. I like to route it so you have a nice curve here, and then have your finger about here, and then that's where we're going to cut it. Now at this point it's very handy to have hose cutters. If you don't, you can use wire cutters or Stanley knife, but you just have to be very careful. Just like so. And we get our hose clamp. I tend to pull the sheathing, the conduit off, just so I can grab the hose easier. Get the hose clamp on. And this bit can be a little bit tricky on some hoses. Slide the clamp back over and then we'll tighten the hose up, tighten the clamp up. Now the clamp's tight, you can fit the conduit back on and proceed with the next one. I like to mimic the same hose curvature and then recut. I just like to link up the two hoses up with another cable tie. Now if you did happen to remove the tail shaft, or if you have this is the point where we would reinstall the tail shaft. Now these bolts do have a lot of Loctite on from factory, so they can be quite firm to remove and to reinstall. But I always like to make sure that the bolts start before using a power tool on them to spin them in. Once the tail shaft is all tight, at this point we can, before we put the covers back on, I like to lower it down, start it, check for leaks, and also top up the oil. Right, now that we have the engine running, we can recheck the oil level. We need to top it up for maybe about a litre. That's probably perfect right there. Now we're almost finished. Now that we've made sure that there is no oil leaks, we can reattach the bash plate, the side cover, and then we'll lower it down and refit the grille. You fit the clips. And that's how you fit the transmission oil cooler kit.